My guest today is Gerard Colasso, an investment manager and a financial advisor. He's a partner at Colasso and Arana, and he also teaches investment management at St. Aloysius Evening College. Welcome to the show, Gerard. So you've been
Thank
an
you.
investment manager and a financial advisor since your early 20s, right?
Yes, 22 actually.
Okay. How did you figure out at such a young age that you'd have a career in finance and investment?
Finance and investment was something that I always had an interest in. Maybe right from the time I was studying first year PUC Commerce at St. Aloysius College in Mangalore. And my interest was kindled because of my deep interest in reading. I was and still am a voracious reader. Nothing comes in between my quota of reading. I still remember when I was in the first year PUC, I used to read the Time magazine in the college library. And at the end of the magazine, every issue, they have a book review. And I think the year was 1979, perhaps, when the review was the second edition of a book called A Random Walk Down Wall Street by Burton G. Malkiel, who heads the Department of Economics at Princeton University. And Malkiel said something fantastic in that book. If you blindfold a chimpanzee that is trained to throw darts at a dartboard, and you keep a Wall Street Journal stock market quotation page on that dartboard, and every time a dart falls on a stock, you pick those stocks and construct a portfolio that is totally picked at random, that portfolio will do as well or as badly as a portfolio of stocks picked by experts. So the book is in its, I think, 10th or 11th edition now. In 2019 was the last edition, and no one has been able to disprove that. So getting this kind of knowledge at the age of 16, just because of my ability or interest in reading, kind of sparked that interest. And I kept that interest going, reading what I could. So by the time I finished college, didn't do much for a year. I went into stocks because the Mangalore Stock Exchange happened to open in September 1985. I got membership a year later in October 1985, and then I got into financial services, primarily as a stockbroker.
Okay. So that's what drew your attention towards investment management.
Yes, we started as stockbrokers, but stockbroking is maybe along the way only one of the things we do.
Okay.
Essentially, it is just putting people's investments in order, giving them a certain direction in their personal investments.
So you read that book when you were 16. Would you say that book is something that can be understood even by a layman?
Actually, when I look back on my own career, I think it's only in India that we have these preconceived notions that you can understand something only at a particular age. I have always had young interns in my office. 3 of them have been aged 15. At the age of 15, this was when they had passed their SSLC or their 10th standard and were going into PUC. At that time, their parents asked permission. And these 3 interns have interned with me for a couple of months. And we used to have interns meetings where there would be this one guy of 15 and all the others, some of them are even investment advisors. And they used to ask questions. And at the end of it, a senior intern, when I say senior, maybe 26, but 11 years older to this 15-year-old kid, he says, the questions that guy asked are amazing, he's pointing to the 15-year-old. So I think we treat even postgraduate students as kids.
Yes.
I treat everyone as an adult.
Okay.
Okay, if somebody has come to my office with an intention of learning, that person will be guided. I do not look at age.
Okay.
I look at interest. I look at a certain ability to grasp.
Okay. And would you say this 15-year-old displays the same competency as his older counterparts?
For his age, perhaps even more.
Okay. I'm surprised.
Yeah. Oh, yes, yes. It, like I told you, We didn't drag that kid here. His parents didn't drag him to our office.
Okay.
He asked his parents, and his parents asked us, guy is only 15, will you take him? I said, 14, I'll take him. Let's see whether he has an interest. I lay a few ground rules for these youngsters. Very simple thing. I say, even if you want to, you're not going to intern the whole day. Not at 15. You must enjoy life. Go about play in the afternoons. You want 3 hours a day? Let's start with 3 hours a day. Okay? So come between 9 and 12, let's say. Or you want 4 hours? Okay, between 9 and 1. Let's see how it goes for 2, 3, 4 days. 2 days later, you say, no, this is not what I expected and I have no interest in this. Please tell me that. I would appreciate it. The last thing I want is to drag somebody to my office and make them sit there against their will, doing something they do not want to do. I would not like to do that.
Okay.
So I told them very clear. Then, okay, we'll take it day by day. Every day in the evening, I ask them, okay, you're okay? Are these things the kind of things that you want? They say, yes, we continue.
So that begs me to ask this question.
Yeah.
If a 15-year-old can do that, then what is the need for a guy like me to go through college?
Good question.
Yeah.
I am notorious for having pulled several youngsters out of the formal education system.
Okay.
Okay, because I have been a very harsh and unapologetic critic of what passes for education in this country. We may have some outstanding educational institutions, but those would be 1% or less. 99% of them do not, in my opinion, qualify to be called educational institutions.
Are any of these educational institutions in Mangalore?
Oh, plenty.
Okay.
Plenty. Because they are just, what shall I say, making people do a lot of rote learning without thinking, without critical thought, imposing a lot of rules, regulations in a very authoritarian fashion.
Okay.
And thinking that that is education, which it isn't.
Okay.
So when you look at my own education, I'm a BCom. I made it very plain to my parents that the moment I finished my BCom, I will not study anything more in a formal educational institution. That is the end of it. Because by then I knew that it is more of brain damage. Let me be blunt. It's brain damage. It's nothing else. Today, 36 years into a career, unbroken 36 years, so reasonably successful, I would say, not 1% of what we have used in our practice was ever learned by me in any classroom.
Okay. So in that case, would you say an MBA course is a bad investment?
If someone has to even contemplate MBA, I would first ask them to read a book. That book is by an author called Dennis Turish. And Dennis Turish is a professor from management colleges in the UK, if I'm not mistaken. He wrote a brilliant book called Management Studies in Crisis: Fraud, Deception, and Meaningless Research. The very title conveys a lot about the thrust of the book. So let me read that title again. Management Studies in Crisis: Fraud, Deception, and Meaningless Research by Dennis Turish. Anyone who wants to do an MBA should read this book. Okay. In my opinion, MBA is one of the most thoroughly useless courses in the world, unless you get into the top, in the Indian context, top 6 or 7 institutes. We're talking about the top 3 or 4 IIMs, maybe Indian School of Business, something along those lines. If you get into those, I do not know too much about the curriculum there, but a few students have told me that yes, the curriculum is also above average, though it's not top of the pops. But what happens to you is you are admitted into an exclusive club. And then you have the networking. You have the networking among your peers who are also from the top management colleges. So life as an executive becomes a little easier If somebody from a local university who's done an MBA from, let's say, the Mangalore University, tries to meet a top executive of a large company in India, he would not get past the front office.
Okay.
But if you're from IIM Ahmedabad, yes, you will. You will, because you would have laid the groundwork, you would have contacts, and it's essentially you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, which is okay. In the world of business, contacts, networking helps.
Okay.
So from that point of view, yes, to get into a top-notch educational institution, either in India or abroad,
Okay.
may add value to your life.
Okay. So what do you think our colleges and universities here in Mangalore can do to adapt themselves to our current time?
Whatever it takes to get a healthy dose of realism into academics,
Okay.
especially in the field of commerce. Perhaps in science they do better, but in arts and commerce, I think it was Robin Sharma who said, knowledge that cannot be applied is useless. So if I make a statement that not even 1% of what I learned in college, where academics are concerned, was of use to me in my career in financial services, and you would expect financial services to be very much an extension of the so-called BCom, because a Bachelor of Commerce. But no, not even 1% of what I have used in my career was ever picked up in a classroom.
Okay.
I am not ungrateful to the educational institution where I studied, because they had a first-rate program of extracurricular activities. And those helped. There's no doubt about it. Plus, there were certain visionary persons, individuals in the management who appreciated the initiative I showed in one or two areas, like public speaking, debating, and went out of the way to provide good training in those areas. So that was education, not what was picked up in the classroom.
Okay. So there is an absence of practical education.
There is you just don't have reality.
Okay.
We want to know how things are going to be applied. Let me give you one example where BCom is concerned. Many youngsters want to become chartered accountants. Rightly so, if they have the interest in accounts and taxation. Because the chartered accountancy qualification is a lifelong asset. And it's a great qualification. Very few people, 3-4% of those who attempted ultimately succeed. The chartered accountancy course involves 3 years of articles in the office of an actual chartered accountant. Now that is worth 1,000 BComs. This is what I mean by an exposure to reality. Because there you are dealing with actual accounts of living, breathing individuals, of businesses, whether proprietorships, partnerships, cooperative societies, trusts, or companies. So you would have the spectrum. You would be knowing about the issues that arise in their accounting, in their direct taxes, like income tax and corporate taxes, also in their indirect taxes, today predominantly GST. This is what I mean by practical exposure. Now, my partner, who has been with me right from the beginning in our partnership firm, had finished his 3 years of articles. I stopped my education at BCom because I was very sure that I do not want to become a chartered accountant. I'm very poor at maths. You may not believe this for a financial.
It's ironic.
It's very ironical, but you'll be surprised to know that at the personal level, investment is so simple that you don't really need to be a maths wizard. So I'm very, very poor at maths. But my partner is brilliant at accounts, also maths. So it's only when we started a firm, since we are first generation entrepreneurs, we had to launch this firm. And no one could give us guidance about how a stockbroker must maintain accounts. So we divided responsibilities. He went to Madras, now called Chennai, because those stockbrokers there are excellent at maintaining accounts and records. And I went to Bombay for a week to pick up the nuances of stockbroking as a business. Because the basics of investment by then I already knew. Because by the time I was 22, I had done a lot of reading on that subject and really good reading for 6 or 7 years since PUC. So I knew the theory of investment, but not the practicalities. Fortunately, I could pick that knowledge in Bombay, and my partner picked up the finer points of accounting over there. And then when I sat with him doing the accounts late into the evening, sometimes at night also, that's when I learned the basics of accounts, not in the BCom.
Oh.
Because I was learning it from someone who has been through the grind of 3 years of articles, and someone who has a natural inclination to accounting.
So you learned a lot of things in your life practically, not through theoretically, not through theories or through by hearting textbooks.
No.
Okay. So since we have an absence of practical and useful education here in Mangalore, is that one of the reasons why you started teaching the diploma course in investment management?
Not really. Not really. This diploma course in investment management is only 16 years old.
Okay.
I have been teaching for possibly 35 years.
Okay.
Mainly as guest lecture. For guest lectures. And also, I remember 1985 October, I started business. Just about 6 months later, I was called upon to give my first talk to the Rotary Club of Mangalore, their main club, where you had a lot of eminent people. And I balked at the prospect because at that time I was 23 years of age. But it went down pretty well. So a 23-year-old person giving a talk on the stock market to several of them were not just very eminent persons in their own fields like chartered accountants and doctors. Several of them were also stock market investors for 2, 3, or 4 decades.
Okay.
But still it went down well because I had taken the trouble to glean my knowledge from the world's best books. For example, that book I told you about, A Random Walk Down Wall Street, is considered one of 3 investment classics.
Okay.
So knowledge doesn't really get better than that.
Which are the other 2?
The other 2. The Intelligent Investor by Benjamin Graham. Not many people have heard of Benjamin Graham, but everybody has heard of Warren Buffett. Benjamin Graham was Warren Buffett's professor in the evening school of Columbia University. And Warren Buffett was the only student who was graded an A by Benjamin Graham. So Benjamin Graham wrote a book called The Intelligent Investor, and that remains an absolute investment classic. And the second book is, of course, I told you, A Random Walk Down Wall Street. The third book is by another investing giant called John Bogle, the founder of Vanguard Mutual Fund, today the 2nd or 3rd largest in the world. That is called Common Sense on Mutual Funds. So these are the 3 investment classics. But if somebody does not know anything about investment and wants to get into some good reading, by all means read these books, but do not start with them.
Okay.
Okay, I'll give you 2 very simple books, eminently enjoyable and readable books to read. The first would be a book called The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. And this book has been published just last year, 2020. It's very conversational. No graphs, charts, mathematics. Very conversational. It's philosophical. It sets you in the right mood to think of and understand money and the role of money in our lives. And the second book is a book called The Millionaire Next Door by 2 American professors, Thomas J. Stanley and William D. Danko. The book has unfortunately not been updated, but it is worth buying it and reading it for its knowledge because it tracks the lives of a number of United States millionaires who did not start off as millionaires. They started off as middle class people or even lower middle class people 3 or 4 decades later, they ended as millionaires without winning a lottery or inheriting money.
Okay.
So these two books, see, at the end of the day, let me tell you, investment at the personal level is not finance and not mathematics. It is the right attitude and the right philosophy.
So it should be very simple, ideally.
Let me clarify one point. So many people think of finance and investment as being so complicated. Investment and finance are two common nouns. They cover a lot of ground. Let me tell you that if you are sitting to draft the union budget of India every year, or for that matter, the British or the American Union budgets, or you are working for the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, especially in their policy sections, then you need to be somewhere between a couple of PhDs from the world's top universities and a Nobel Prize. You must be somewhere at that level. And you must have fantastic qualifications in economics, finance, mathematics, accounting, investment, number of these fields.
Okay.
That is investment and finance at the macro level. But it also operates at the micro level.
At a personal level.
At the level of you and me, where we are normal human beings. We earn, we spend. Hopefully, our spending is lesser than our earning, and the surplus we save. At that personal level, investment is exceptionally simple.
No.
And that is why no less than Warren Buffett said this very clearly: investing is simple but not easy.
How can something so simple not be easy? How can that paradox exist?
It's very easy to understand this.
Okay.
There's no paradox at all, because Warren Buffett is now talking about investment at the micro level, at our level.
Okay.
And there he says, it is simple in the sense it is very easy to grasp the fundamentals. I'll give you 1 or 2 examples to drive home the point. What is not easy? It requires a lot of perseverance, persistence, and staying the course. That is not easy. Let me give you one example. Take anyone who is now perhaps aged 70 or 75. When this individual was 30 or 35, 40 years ago, the person bought a simple plot of land, because in those days there were no flats, a simple plot of land, and built a small house on it for his or her residence. It need not be even in a so-called prime location, but a reasonably good residential location. 40 years ago, this particular asset was purchased.
Okay.
If you find out what was the cost of that asset 40 years ago and what is the cost of the asset today, don't be surprised if the prices have gone up by 300 to 350 times. Now, you don't need to be a professor of economics to know, even mentally, that something that has gone up, say, 350 times in value over the last 40 years has easily beaten inflation.
Yes.
And what do we mean by beating inflation? The moment your return on an asset exceeds inflation, your wealth grows. If the return on your asset equals inflation, the value of your wealth is protected. It remains the same. If the return that you earn is lower than the inflation rate, you have actually done damage to your finances. It's as simple as this. So what did these people do to buy that house and then get these kind of fantastic returns of 14 or 15% compounded annualized, which is much higher than the retail inflation rate during that time, which would have been about 9 or 9.5%, and earn several percentage points of return higher than the inflation rate. And therefore, if they sell that house today, they will get a small fortune. And many times you will hear people saying, when we bought that house or that plot of land back in, let's say, 1970 or 1980, we did not expect that it would grow to this level. Let's take the stock market. 1979, 3rd of April, you had the first quotation of the Bombay Stock Exchange Sensitive Index. 124 points, 124.15 points. Today, 48 or 49,000. Okay, 400 times. Oh, sorry, yes, 400 times. So the same thing. Suppose you didn't know anything about investment or finance, but you came to know in 1979 that the Bombay Stock Exchange is coming out with this 30 stock sensitive index. So let's look at those 30 stocks. Said, okay, these are India's leading companies and it is pretty well diversified. So let me see whether there's some way I can put my money directly into this and replicate an index. In those days, you couldn't do it. Today, you can do it very easily because there are index mutual funds, which will do it for you at a very low cost. But had you been able to do it, you would have got a 400 times return, which translates to a little over 15% compounded, because that's the correct return to see. You would have beaten inflation handsomely by apparently doing nothing.
Okay.
But if you analyze, it is not that you did nothing. You actually did two things. You bought an asset and then you held on to it for the long term.
Okay.
Buy and hold.
Okay.
The oldest and best strategy in a growth investment.
And that sounds like a very simple strategy as
It
well.
is.
It is.
You don't believe me. At least believe Warren Buffett.
Okay.
That's where he's saying investment is simple.
Okay.
It's not easy to hold on to it
Okay.
for 40 years.
Because that requires a lot of self-discipline.
It also requires courage.
Okay.
In between, you'll have the Gulf War, you'll have the droughts, you'll have the Harshad Mehta scam, you'll have the technology bubble and the bursting of that bubble, you'll have the Ketan Parekh scam, you'll have the 9/11 terrorist attacks, you will have the global financial crisis, you will have, just the other days, COVID-19.
Okay.
Through all that, to remain invested, you don't think of it when you do it for your house because you need a place to stay.
Okay.
You pass through a lot of things. But the stock market is different because it's so easy to trade in the stock market. And stockbrokers will try to make you trade again and again and again.
Because they want that brokerage.
Every time you buy or sell, every time you transact, brokerage is generated.
Okay.
Very few investment professionals will tell you, no, buy and hold. So frequently trading is an excellent way of making stockbrokers rich.
And this also requires a certain level of planning.
Yes.
One line from your class really resonated with me, and that is, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail.
Yes. Yes.
Can you emphasize on that?
Oh, yeah, definitely. You see, I was lucky to have parents who, if there was any even slightly important step that they had to take in life, they would discuss it. And while not specifically including my sister and me in that conversation, neither would they discuss it privately. They would discuss it within our earshot. And I always remember maybe a renovation of a tiny portion of our ancestral home wouldn't by any standard today appear to be a big deal. But they would discuss and discuss and discuss and discuss and put pen to paper. I was exposed to this kind of planning pretty early on. Something told me that there is some value in this. So when they engaged people to implement that plan, they would very clearly explain the plan to those people. And any deviation from that plan would not be tolerated. And something told me that they managed to obtain optimum value from that kind of planning. Now, when I started reading the good books on investment, I was happy to find the kind of emphasis that is laid there on a good attitude, on a good philosophy, and using that attitude and philosophy that you must draw up an investment policy for yourself. And the policy that you draw is just the starting point of a plan to take you through investment in your life. Now, planning is one area, I'm afraid, where we Indians are not good at all. Whereas we are second to none in intelligence and ability. But we have a rotten environment in our education system and otherwise. That is why Indians do so well the moment they leave India.
Okay.
They flourish. If you see the kind of success that Indians have achieved in a country like the United States, it is as if bright, brilliant young minds were just waiting to be released from some kind of prison to blossom in the right environment. So planning is very important. You speak to a Westerner, that person knows exactly what he or she are doing this evening, tomorrow, a week from now, a month from now. They know when they are going to take their next vacation and where and how they are going to budget it.
My God. I don't know what I'm doing even after this podcast, honestly.
Here, if you ask me or if you ask a normal person, what are you doing this evening? What are you doing tomorrow? I don't know what I'm doing this evening. Is there an evening? Whereas for me, I know exactly what I'm doing at any given time. Several days from now, everything is planned. My day is planned. I have my routine. I'm not inflexible.
Okay.
Because human life is very dynamic. I try to keep my mind as well as my schedules reasonably flexible. But there is a plan. There is a backup. Okay, so, and that, believe me, makes you so effective. It eliminates wastage to such a great extent. So, in investment, it's the same thing. It's a plan.
Okay. Have you personally seen lives being ruined as a result of bad financial planning?
To my misfortune, every day. Every day.
Okay.
Just as a doctor sees terminally ill patients, somebody who has neglected, and the doctor, when the reports are out, the doctor knows this person has days or months to live. Similarly, you can have totally bad financial situations. You can have people caught in debt traps, people caught in what we call retirement traps. If you ask me to identify one area where people like us are really worried about, it is more and more Indians hopelessly unprepared for retirement. Because you can retire at 60, you can live, thanks to medical and other science today, you can live easily, forget your 80s, people are hitting 90 these days. If you close your eyes and meditate for a moment on that period of between 60 and 90, that is 30 years. It's almost another working lifetime. But it's different from the 30 to 60 time frame. Because when you're 60 to 90, your ability to work and earn slowly comes down. Your capacity to withstand financial shocks diminishes. Your health uncertainties increase. Okay. So it is not a good time to take financial stress. It is a period of life which can be enjoyed. And in the advanced countries, they have a term for it. They call it successful aging. But one of the prerequisites to enjoy the latter part of your life and for successful aging is a solid financial nest egg.
Okay. In India, I think people don't have a retirement plan because they expect their kids to take care of them.
Let me tell you, an overwhelming majority of the so-called kids that I have seen actually want to and do look after their parents, monetarily or otherwise. See, in a small town like Mangalore, from which we are having this program, the opportunities are limited. So a lot of our bright young people will not be working here. They will look for careers outside the city. It could be in India, it could be outside India. So, a physical taking care of their parents may be a little difficult. So, they may depend upon certain institutions or have some kind of domestic help or little qualified beyond that caregivers, for example, to look after them. But they are always ready to contribute and take care of their parents. There are a few exceptions where children, for some reason, abandon their parents. We have seen that also. But let me emphasize, most young people are good. Most young people have the interests of their parents at heart. They go to great sacrifice to provide a happy retirement for their parents. But now let me flip the whole issue.
Yes.
Let's come from the parents' point of view.
Okay.
Which parent is going to be comfortable knowing that we don't have enough and we are being a burden
Exactly.
to our kids? And when you realize that, you have a lot of problems, including stress and mental health issues, just because of this one factor. That is what we would not like to see. We have even seen the elderly almost refusing to spend the money sent to them by their kids for their own maintenance. Just trying to make fixed deposits with that and keep it because we don't want to touch it. And actually living life at a very, low quality of life, which is sad. So it behooves everyone to put in place a kind of a future financial plan where during their economically productive years or decades, they will work, they will invest wisely, and they will build up a sufficiently high retirement corpus.
Okay. Speaking of bad financial moves, what would you tell to those people who take loans not out of necessity but for cosmetic purposes like buying an expensive car or going on foreign vacation?
I recommended 2 books to you, The Millionaire Next Door and The Psychology of Money. Must read. That is where they have a lot of beautiful sayings. For example, in The Millionaire Next Door, you have a saying called, "You are not what you drive." Driving a fancy car does not mean you're rich. Walking does not mean you're poor. So this kind of a philosophy, one of the worst things in modern life is this whole issue of keeping up with the Joneses. I cannot bear to think of my relation, my friend, my neighbor living a lifestyle apparently better than mine, splurging money on a lot of things. When you read the good books on investment, nowhere do they tell you to live like a miser. They tell you enjoy life. Plan your enjoyments also, so you become more effective in your enjoyments. But if you start trying to keep up with the Joneses, that is the beginning of some kind of financial death wish. And the worst manifestation of that kind of financial death wish is, as you said, taking loans for unproductive purposes, just to keep up with someone, just to do that. I mean, we have sometimes, I feel, lost our whole sense of what is sensible. I have an example of a case. Actual lower middle class family, not even a middle class family. They had to celebrate a relatively unimportant function of their child. It's a celebration. It's something like 200 people, where it was not necessary. You could have done it with 10 people in the family. And you had a lavish lunch. You had the games, the MC, the band, not the band, but the sound system, the normal thing. So they spent money on it which they could not afford to. And they could not even have had that function without taking loans. They took loans to organize that function. And I'm telling you again, I don't want to go into details, but it was a relatively unimportant function. It's not any major milestone. And during the vote of thanks, the lady of the house who's giving the vote of thanks, she thanks a lot of people, including the neighbors who helped them organize the function, the caterers, the MC, and the other. And then she says, and all those who gave loans. So I said, we have lost the sense of even being sensible any longer.
Okay.
So it's an open admission that I took a loan for having this function of 2 hours or 3 hours. There was no need for it.
Yes.
I'm not saying you should not have had celebrated a particular occasion in the life of a child. It was not important enough to merit 200 people coming there. You could have done it with your immediate family. 10 people cooked at home and just had a nice little family function. But you extend it to 200.
Yes.
You take a loan for it. Where is this going to lead someone?
And it was for an unproductive purpose.
Totally.
Yes.
Totally.
It was not like a home loan or a business loan.
No.
Yes.
It wasn't.
It was done just to impress others because behavior is a very contagious disease.
Because for my neighbors and my relations,
Yes.
they who had children of that same age, when it came to that particular kind of a function, they celebrated at this level. We cannot be seen to celebrate at a level lower than that. I love something my sister always says. She says, simplicity should be our style. And that is what I have tried to incorporate in my life. It's not that we don't live a comfortable life. We do take our good holidays from time to time. We live a very comfortable life. But there's a difference between a reasonably comfortable life and unnecessary lavishness. I think it was Jeffrey Sachs who said, if I'm not mistaken, let me see if I have noted it down somewhere. Living doesn't cost much, but showing off does. Jeffrey Sachs is one of the world's most famous developmental economists. So living doesn't cost much, but showing off does.
I know such kind of steps can put you in financial slavery where you owe a lot of money to others and you can't even come out of it.
Exactly.
Then how do we attain financial freedom?
How do you attain financial freedom? It's a very good question. We, like I said, we change our mindset. Now, I know that's a cliche. I can say change your mindset. It's almost impossible to do so. But not as difficult as you think, because there is a lovely branch of knowledge called behavioral economics or behavioral finance. And using behavioral economics and behavioral finance, you can change the mindset of people even without their realizing it. Now, what is behavioral finance? It is an amalgamation of economics and psychology. And one of the most famous examples is given by Richard Thaler, a brilliant behavioral economist who won the 2017 Nobel Prize for Economics. So you now know what level it is. And he gives the actual example, this is an actual example, of the Schiphol airport, international airport in Amsterdam. Now, what happened in Schiphol? I'm sorry to bring this up, but this is a very interesting example. You had the men's urinals. And Schiphol found one particular thing, that there was a lot of spillage. Why? You would expect, at least in an advanced European country, that people are very particular about it. One of the reasons was probably the loudspeakers also sound in the bathroom, because somebody whose flight is, an important announcement, they don't want people to meet. And so when people like us, the males, are busy doing our business, we get distracted. We miss our aim. So this was one of the problems that they encountered at Schiphol. And the next question was, how do you sort this out? One thing is you can disconnect the loudspeakers there, but then it may do more harm than good. A brilliant behavioral economist got the idea of painting a life-size, realistic image of a common housefly in the urinal just above the trap. This is a play on male psychology.
Okay.
Give them a target and they will aim. Spillage reduced by 80%.
Wow.
And Richard Taylor's book on this is called Nudge.
Okay.
Okay? The whole book is about improving financial decisions. No punishments, no fines. Obviously, no CCTV cameras for that operation.
Okay.
But this gentle nudge, a small little drawing, that was replicated on all of them. And my nephew is now working in the Netherlands. So he goes to Amsterdam pretty often. In fact, he catches his flights back to India from Amsterdam. He says, yes, he's saying, it's not just, it started in the international airport. He's saying every restaurant there. So he's promised me that when I go there for my next holiday to the Netherlands, he's not going to show me anything other. He's going to drag me to various urinals and show me, listen, this is what you brought to my attention. Now look at this.
A housefly.
A housefly on this could change. Now let's come to investment. Let's take a simple equation because I myself can't go beyond this. You earn an income, you have an expense, and you have savings. So what's the equation? Income minus expenditure is equal to savings. Use behavioral finance, change the equation. Income minus savings should be expenditure. Okay, so supposing I'm earning 60,000 rupees a month. After taxes and deductions, 50,000 rupees gets credited to my bank account. That's called my net income. Now let me decide how much I want to blow up, how much I want to save. Suppose I come to the conclusion that I can live comfortably on 30,000 rupees, but 20,000 rupees I'm going to save. How do we apply this change of equation to a practical situation? What we do is, we ask the person, on which day of the month is your salary credited to your account? Supposing the person says around the 5th of the month. We take a date called the 10th, closest to 5th, allowing 4 or 5 days because sometimes there could be some holiday, some hitch, so 2-3 day delay could be there. But it's a 10th is safe, 10th is safe. On the 10th, automatically 20,000 goes into various investments. You can do it automatically today by giving standing instructions.
So that's the housefly.
That's the housefly here, right? That's the housefly here.
Okay.
Okay? And what happens is, since the amount disappears and nobody is going to blow 50,000 rupees in 5 days, the 20,000 is gone. Slowly, the person's mindset changes to think of what I'm getting is 30,000, not 50,000.
Okay.
So with this 30,000, I have to live not for 2 or 3 days, but for the month. Many people, you know what they have done? They become very careful about their spending so that still 12 to 14 out of the 30,000 remains till the end of the month. End of the month, they have a good party. Okay, so because they know, no, we can't go beyond this 30,000. Now, this is how behavioral finance works. And this is what I meant when I said knowledge that cannot be applied is useless.
Okay.
Whether it was the housefly in that place or this kind of a knowledge that we use is the kind of knowledge I would like in our educational institutions. So you tell me, if you have had the misfortune of studying commerce,
I have.
you have, how different those books are from what is needed to succeed in life. Let me tell you about reading and books, because this is very closely related. There is a book which I consider to be the best book on investment, written as a fresh book after the year 2000. That is by a neurologist, an actual medical doctor, called Dr. William J. Bernstein. And he has written a book called The Four Pillars of Investing. And he wrote the book simply because he couldn't get proper advice when he sought it. So he studied finance and investment and wrote one of the most brilliant books on finance and investment. Unfortunately, not updated since probably 2010. But this is a book that was published in 2002 or 3, I forget now. So about 18 years have passed. And this book I have read 14 times. And about a year later, I'm going to read it again. Because every time I read this book, I have one more year in practice. I can relate to something that has happened in this year which I didn't relate to in the past. Besides, it's a very well-written book. It's a little cerebral book. Somebody wants to start a program on reading, I would not recommend that as the first book. But certainly, it's one of the books that should be a must-read. Similarly, the 3 books I gave you, I don't think there's a single book among them now that I haven't read at least 10 times. That is education. Now you tell me, would you like to go back and read any of your commerce textbooks again?
I don't think I've read it in the first place.
You're with me.
Okay.
You're with me there. So I used to just read enough to get reasonably good marks in the exams. And that was for the exams. So what I always say is the tragedy of Indian education is that we do not have a system of education. What we have in this country is a system of examinations, not a system of education.
Okay. The idea that I get from you is that psychology plays a very important role in investment.
In anything, in life.
Okay. So do you think we should start teaching psychology to commerce students?
Definitely. At least a very basic level. In fact, one of my close friends is Dr. Shalini Ayyappa. She is currently head of the Department of Psychology at St. Aloysius. And her students love her because she is not like your normal run-of-the-mill professor. She really conveys value in psychology to her students. And if I'm not mistaken, on her initiative, the college has started, I don't know whether it's a bachelor's degree or a master's degree, but in something called corporate psychology. Now that is in the Department of Psychology. But I think those kind of subjects should be taught to commerce students. Make it one of the papers. Reduce the drivel that is taught to students. Make the education more experiential. There are so many ways you can do it. If somebody has the will. For example, collect data about all your 500 or 1,000 commerce students. Your parents, what do? Are they in employment? If so, what kind of employment? Are they in business? Have a whole host of businesses. Are they professionals? What kind of professions? That is a golden database that you can do. I'm trying to answer your question here of what can we do to make education more real, more experiential. Start with the resource that you have in your hands and you don't realize it. Parents are working and earning, and that's why they can send their children to schools, especially the more prestigious schools. Now, once you have this database, slowly see, here's a doctor who's one of the parents. Here are a whole bunch of doctors. Can we have a meeting with about half a dozen of them where they will come and lecture our young men and women about health, about exercise, about the basic physiology of the body, about diet and food? They'll be happy to do it. We are not saying that it should be subjects taught day in and day out. One lecture, 2 lectures, or 2 or 3 of them just share. I don't think any parent will refuse to come and just give one talk to an educational institution where their own son or daughter is studying. Next, the professionals, the other professionals, the chartered accountants. What does it entail to be a chartered accountant? The business people, from proprietorships to partnerships to companies. What are the businesses that they are in? How did they start? When did they start? Were they first generation entrepreneurs? Are they, or have they stepped into family owned businesses? What have been the challenges along the way? What would they have liked to do different? We must make use of the resources we have, and the resources are parents. I'm talking about injecting a healthy dose of realism into our educational system. Can we have such a good database of parents where we know exactly what the parents are doing and get them for talks to students? Now, you can run into difficulties there. A leading chartered accountant or a leading doctor may be a good public speaker. A small businessman who plays a very important role both in the economy of the country and in providing for his or her own family may not want to come and address 2, 3, 400 students or even a class of 60 or 80. But there are ways of getting around that problem. Such a parent may not be averse to sitting with a group of just 8 to 10 interested students, sitting in a small circle and talking, rather than before a podium with a microphone and sound system. So there are many ways in which we can harness the experience of parents because they live in the real world.
Yes.
That is why they are earning, and that is why they can afford to pay for their children's educational expenses.
Yes, this is a very necessary innovation that is required in our education system.
Totally.
One of the things that I hated a lot about our education system is the mandatory attendance, and I'm really grateful that you didn't implement that in your diploma course.
I did away with it.
Okay.
I'll put my foot down.
Okay.
It was there in the first 1 or 2 batches. And it is below my dignity to drag anyone to my class. If someone wants to listen to me, they should come voluntarily. And mine was always a voluntary course. So attendance never made any sense to me. Somebody has paid a fee. You pay a fee and choose not to attend. Well, you have probably good reasons for doing so. You choose to attend and you're tired. You choose to sleep off during the class. I'm fine with that. You made the effort to come there. But when someone comes and sits in a class without fear of exams, without fear of attendance, you reach a stage which I call the joy of learning. What is the joy of learning? I come and sit in a class, or I pick up a book to read simply because I want to do it. I'm interested in doing it. And I believe that by doing or indulging in this particular activity, some good is going to happen to me. This is a concept called the joy of learning. Now, you said in your time, attendance was done away with.
It was joyless learning.
That was in your normal course.
Yes.
But in the course I taught, there was no attendance.
Okay.
You appreciated that.
Yes.
Now we have gone beyond that. There are no exams. So those who want to pay the fee and enroll as students, this year, of course, because of COVID, it's online, but I have knocked off the exams. And there will not be exams in my course after this. I will refuse to set question papers. It's the joy of learning. You come, pick up knowledge without stress. Okay, that is what I call the joy of learning. And any speech or course that I'm going to, or course that I'm going to conduct, or speech I'm going to give after this will have my conditions. No one is to be dragged there.
Okay.
I don't mind if there are 10 people, but 10 interested people.
Quality over quantity.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Let's discuss this.
Okay.
In an atmosphere that's free and where you have every right to disagree with me. There's no authoritarianism. There's no rigidity. There are no rules and regulations imposed on you. I'm not going to tell you in what attire to attend my course. No uniforms. and no rules, regulations, attendance, or examinations. Because what I'm doing there is what I've practiced in my life. Now, all this time I've been hitting out at education. But let me tell you, I am a great worshipper of the goddess Saraswati. That is a brilliant concept we have in India, where education and knowledge is elevated to the level of divinity. Because I have been in education the moment I left college. Even today I read. My minimum reading is 1 to 1.5 hours, Monday to Friday, twice or thrice that time on Saturdays and Sundays. All the time I have reading material around me. I have got a minute, I will open the book and read. I'm waiting at a doctor's office, I will be reading a book. Let us understand one thing. Education, what does it mean? Education is not just something that is imparted, one teacher and a lot of students there. Education can also be acquired. If we have our second session, I will go into the dictionary meaning of education. And I think this dictionary meaning should first be read by all our educationists, from the Union Education Minister down to the lowest primary teacher. Okay. Because the dictionary defines education in the best possible way. But for today, I will tell you that I am a great believer in education, not the crap that passes for education in 99% of Indian educational institutions. Okay. And for me, I'm giving you the 5 best educational institutions in the world. With that, we'll probably end our session today. Okay. The first is a dictionary. When I was very young, I was a voracious reader from fairy tales to novels. When I didn't understand a word, I would run to my mother and ask her, what does this word mean? She never gave me the meaning. Out came a fat book called the dictionary. Find your meaning yourself. That is education. When I grew a little older, I had difficulty grasping not words, but concepts. No Wikipedia those days. But my dad told me that there is such a thing called an encyclopedia. And he recommended Encyclopedia Britannica. Now, in an educational institution, obtaining access to an encyclopedia is more difficult than filing your income tax return. So, luckily, there was the Karnad Sadashiv Rao Library, very close to St. Aloysius, where, unknown to many, in those days, there was a reference section. It's been decades since I stepped in there now. The government is paying for your light and fan, comfortable place to sit, encyclopedia available to you on demand. And I used to spend hours there going through various concepts, 30 volumes of the encyclopedia. Those days costing 36,000 rupees, several lakhs by today's standard. And the government is providing you. That's when I realized that even the government can do some good if it wants to. So this was what my parents exposed me to. So I would like to end today's session by telling you and the viewers here about the 5 greatest educational institutions in this world: a dictionary, an encyclopedia, a library, a bookstore, and in today's context, internet resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerard. This past 1 hour has been extremely insightful, and we'll have you back for the second part.
Thank you so much.